But the children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, Prince Louis, have never actually attended any public event north of the border. It's quite hard to believe, given that Prince George is now 13. But what they did here was the Commonwealth Games were in Glasgow, and so on their way to their holiday in Balmoral, they visited the Commonwealth Games and they watched various sports and had a great time, judging by their interactions with some of the people taking part, and there was quite a few exchanges that were interesting.
There were some great photos, Richard Kay, as Richard mentioned. What stood out to you there?
I think Prince Louis in his bucket hat. Did you see that one? He was wearing a Welsh cycling bucket hat, and he proudly had it on his head. I won't try and pronounce it in Welsh, but it's something like Beirw Cymru. And he had a wide smile on his face while they were watching the games. And as Richard says, it is interesting that they, as a family, they've done so little in terms of public engagements north of the border. But again, it sort of echoes this thing. They love sport as a family. And I think they find it easy for the children to engage with watching sport, whatever kind of sport it was. And there were some interesting sportsmen and women who were photographed with them. I saw Sir Chris Hoy, the great cyclist, and Dame Laura Kenny sitting next to the Duchess of Rothesay, as Catherine is, north of the border. I think it looked like the whole family sort of bought into the whole thing. And
then indeed, it was very nice to see Charlotte with Prince Edward as well, her great uncle. Indeed. Edward and Sophie, the Edinburghs, were also there, slightly overlooked, inevitably, because of the presence of the entire Wales family, but they all seemed to get along terribly well. Richard Eden, we also learned a little bit more about the Wales children through those exchanges with some of those athletes, didn't we?
The one that made me laugh was, I think it was Dame Laura Kenny had asked the children whether they'd like to see their parents on a bike together, on a sort of tandem race later, and George's immediate reaction was, no, thank you, to which William said, yeah, I think we embarrassed the children enough already. But yeah, I think George has definitely got to that age where your parents can be a bit embarrassing, as I know to my cost. But we learnt a bit more about the sort of sports that they enjoy, and
it wasn't always like this, was it? The sort of royals' presence in Scotland was quite different before, especially when it came to William and Harry, for example. Well, yes. I mean, I think possibly because they were Charles's children, and Charles took his Scottish and takes his Scottish heritage incredibly seriously. You know, this is a man who always wears a kilt, come rain or shine, north of the border. Something, again, we've discussed William does not do, and I've never seen Harry in a kilt either. And I think that it is significant. But of course, for Harry and William, they were being introduced at a very young age to royal duty, pretty much from the age of 9 or 10 onwards. And William has taken an entirely different path. He is not having his children doing like that. He will allow us to see glimpses of them from time to time, for which we're very grateful. But otherwise, it's childhood and schooling and education first. That's perfectly true. I mean, I wouldn't say they welcomed us back in the 1980s. In fact, I seem to recall that every summer and every Christmas, we got a very formal letter from the palace reminding us, our editors, that the royal family were on holiday and they wanted their privacy respected. But they did expect to be photographed when they strayed into public areas. And Richard's right, particularly on the Sandringham estate. Public roads crisscross the estate, and you could often just bump into the royals. I bumped into a whole family one day, just out for a walk. And I'm not sure who was more shocked, me or them. But I made myself scarce fairly quickly. Later, and more also on Prince George and kilts, royals in kilts. That comes up a bit later too. Lots to talk about. Before that, though, to the arrival of a royal baby. Richard Eden, tell us the news.
Yeah, this is a lovely and a rare piece of good news for Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and Sarah Ferguson, that they have another grandchild. So Princess Eugenie has had a baby girl. She's got 2 boys, August and Ernest, and she now has a daughter whose name we don't yet know. But the big news is that the girl was born in Portugal. First member of the royal family such a prominent member of the royal family to be born outside the UK for quite some time.
That really is unusual, isn't it, Richard Kay?
It's highly unusual. I mean, one's tempted to offer a couple of explanations. Obviously, one, to minimise perhaps the publicity around it. I think both Eugenie and her sister Beatrice have been absolutely horrified by what has happened to their parents and the knock-on effect on them and their family. And they've done their level best to sort of keep below the parapet for quite a few months now. But the other thing is so intriguing is of course, this baby may well be entitled to an EU passport, which is are highly prized among some people who like to travel a lot to Europe without the restrictions which are now imposed on those of us who travel on British passports. Whether that will be the case, we'll have to wait and see. But it is highly unusual for someone who's relatively close in the line of succession to the throne. Baby Brooksbanks, as we must call her for the moment, is number 15, I think, pushing her great uncle, Prince Edward, down to number 16 in the process. And again, it is rare, as Richard says, for close members of the royal family to be born outside the UK.
Perhaps they'll choose a sort of Portuguese-themed name for her. I think I would suggest Catarina, perhaps, because the last Portuguese-born member of the royal family, I think, was Catherine of Braganza, who was Charles II's widow.
Yeah.
She was born in Lisbon, I think. So perhaps after her and after another prominent Catherine in the family.
You mentioned Beatrice there. She turns 38 in just a couple of days. You expect...
Well, perhaps they'll go and visit them in Portugal. I'm sure that Harry and Meghan will have seen Eugenie and Jack while they were in Portugal. And as we know from their copious holiday snaps, which they shared with the world, there were quite a few from Portugal.
Now, talking of the Yorks brings us to the death of Paddy McNally, a former racing driver and businessman, reportedly worth hundreds of millions of pounds. He was Sarah Ferguson's boyfriend before she married the then Prince Andrew. Richard Kay, take us back to their romance.
Paddy McNally was a widower. His wife died young with two small sons. And Sarah Ferguson was a chalet girl. And basically, he hired her as nanny for the children at his luxuriously appointed villa in Verbier in Switzerland. And it's where Sarah Ferguson became such a competent and very good skier in those early years. And the relationship between master and servant, if you like, changed, and they became boyfriend and girlfriend. And for around 3 years, Sarah and Paddy were in a relationship. To be his wife, she wanted a ring on her finger, and he prevaricated and in the end said no. And then that summer she was a house guest at Windsor Castle, and we all know what happened next. That's where she met Prince Andrew, and a year later they were married. But nevertheless, her relationship with Paddy remained strong and close. He was a constant feature at all the events in her and Andrew's lives. The arrival of...
It had been reported that the royal, formerly known as Prince Andrew, would not be receiving an invitation to Balmoral this summer. But a new report suggested that he might still make his way up there. Tell us about that.
Balmoral is huge and it has many properties. So you can easily stay, for example, if the king doesn't want to see his brother, which seems to be the case at the moment, it's quite easy to avoid each other. And the possibility has been mentioned that he could stay with other members of his family at Craiggowan Lodge, which is a lovely house there where he and his family have stayed in the past.
That's about it.
Yes, this is really interesting. It's some figures that I've uncovered this week, and it's all to do with the Royal Foundation of the Prince and Princess of Wales. Now, what's interesting in particular is that they have a US branch, the American Friends of the Royal Foundation, and it's doing really well. In the past year, it raised almost £9 million. Not sure what that is in dollars, but that's a lot. And that was up by about £4 million since the previous year. Now you think, wow, I mean, it illustrates how popular William and Catherine are in the USA, but also it's a contrast with Harry and Meghan, who, you know, they had great ideas for their their own foundation. Just to go back to the history, they used to be part of the Royal Foundation, and Meghan was invited to join. But when they quit royal duties, they left to set up their own foundation that was called Archewell. And recently they've slimmed that down. There were quite a few redundancies, and they've said they're going to change the way that they donate money. But the donations have been nothing like this scale. So for William and Catherine to sort of, I'd say sort of cock a snook in the backyard of Harry and Meghan is quite interesting. And we'll see how much Harry and Meghan go back to that philanthropic sort of whole idea they had of raising money, and we'll see how that works for them.
Would it be fair to say that while the Wells family have just gone out, just have to sort of go out to dominate the media, dominate the public attention, the Sussexes have to sort of drum up interest to an extent?
They absolutely do. They have to keep popping their heads up above the parapet and say, don't forget about us. And how do they do that? Well, they do that in a multitude of ways, but primarily through these curated photographs, often shot at the back of the heads of their children, which will just appear. And it is clearly a reminder to not just to the royal family, but to the watching world that they're still here, we're still here, we haven't gone away. But it is a very odd way to go about things. It contrasts completely with the way that William and Catherine do things. They're very upfront about their children. They don't blank out their faces, and we see them. We've managed to watch them growing up as a consequence of this. We haven't been overloaded with photographs, but we do get an idea of how they're coping and living as a family. With Meghan and Harry, there's something sly about the way they do this, and there's always this sort of nagging worry in the back of our minds that there is some sort of commercial driver behind it all. There is a money-making enterprise at work here, and we're never entirely clear what that is. But I thought Richard's story was absolutely fascinating, because William and Catherine don't make any overt efforts to raise funds in the United States. They don't visit there very often, and yet there is a huge amount of support for them, which really is something they may well want to tap into much further down the line.
Yeah, on the subject of Harry and Meghan's social media, this week we saw it was Meghan's 45th birthday, so she announced it with a post on Instagram, which was her leaping into their outdoor swimming pool, holding a bunch of balloons and wearing her sunglasses. Now, for me, obviously, it was an effort to be jolly, but it did seem kind of desperate, because it was like, look at me, I'm so different from the royals. We've been on this programme discussing images that have been released to mark royals' birthdays. I mean, take Queen Camilla, for example, a picture of her looking resplendent in a blue dress we saw recently. And so this was saying, we're different, we're fun, and it just came across as a bit desperate. But just as Richard was saying, that same day, we had another post from her company, as ever. And they said, from our founder. This company is very small. So, this is, let's be frank, this is posted by Meghan. And it was a gallery of images. And the second one was showing off their range of jams and everything. And you think, oh, give us a break. It's your birthday. We don't need you to, tell us to buy your blooming jam. But that's the point, that everything for them, it does have that commercial purpose. And this is a repeat of it. And what it is that Harry's invited his father to the Invictus Games in Birmingham next year, and he's very keen for him to attend the opening ceremony and for them to make a joint appearance. And you kind of think, well, I'm sure he is, and people are angry about it because they feel that he's taking advantage, that why should the king sort of be pressured into this? But what I would say to that is that Invictus is not just Harry's thing. At the first ever games in London, there were several members of the family were there. I think the king was there, Prince William and Queen Camilla, who at the time, Duchess of Cornwall, was also there, I think. And they were all there to lend their support. It was launched by the Royal Foundation. And yes, it was Harry's project, but they still support it. And whether the king attends the games in Birmingham next year or not, I can say for definite he will be supporting it and will probably express his support in some way, because it is a very, useful and worthwhile cause, helping injured and sick former service personnel.